The Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you more than all cattle and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you will go, and dust you will eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. Capital letter C, Eden events and a review of our outline so far. And we're not reviewing the entire outline, but at least some of it. Minuscule letter B in the unmatched parentheses, the formation of the human being. In other words, we've already looked at the way in which the soul was put together. Now we want to see how the human being as the whole unit is formed and put together. And so, number 2, a glimpse at biological life. We have looked at non-cellular life, we have looked at single-cell life, and today we're going to look at multi-cell organisms, that is, multi-cell life. The non-cellular life, we noted that it is like a virus or like artificial life, like robots and software that you can utilize in a computer. And there's a lot of movies that are out about, the Transformers and how they might overtake the world and that they will get smarter than human beings and somehow they will protect all the electric outlets so that we can't pull the plug on them, or they will hide their data button. Data had a button in the back of his neck, and whenever they needed him to shut up, somebody would go up there and push that button and he would just hang his head and he would be gone. So, artificial life, non-cellular life. Now this is important for us because we are going to be talking about how it is that God made man so that he becomes a living, walking, talking human being. And that requires cell life, cellular life. Letter B, single cell life forms. And we looked at a number of these guys. We looked at the amoeba, we looked at the algae, we looked at the malaria parasite, we looked at the slime mold, and we looked at that big, huge fungus among us that was like over 3 miles long. The largest living thing on Earth, found in the state of Oregon. Not only is it 3.5 miles long, but it's about 3 to 4 feet thick. And that's how deep it goes into the soil. You could be walking over the top of it and not even know it. Everywhere that this fungus goes, it kills trees. So we looked at that and we noted that there are a lot of living things and that they are single-celled, and that sometimes single cells join together, and even though they're not an organism as such, they work in a community. And it seems that that's the case with this big humongous fungus. Conclusion. Number 7 in the small Roman numerals, the conclusion. These life forms cannot exist unless they are getting life from an already existing life form. And so this is very important. A fungus, for instance, cannot exist if it's not sucking the life out of something else that's alive. Now let's move on to the multi-cell organisms. Multi-cell organisms. You learned in school that life is looked at and categorized according to the number of cells. If it has one cell, then it's a single cell organism. If it's a multi-cell organism, then that multi-cell organism will replicate itself and become an organism. That organism will then categorize itself and design or produce organs. And those organs then organize themselves and make some kind of a moving animation. So These multicell organisms range from very small, they're microscopic, to a very large animal life and a very large human life. So for instance, whales are very, very large. They're multicell. I think somebody was saying that the heart of the whale weighs something like 14 pounds?
400.
400 pounds? Just think about that, you know. And that in order for a whale to breathe, or in order for it to stay underwater for as long as it does, which is what, about 20 minutes or 40 minutes, it has to first take in 14 minutes worth of breath, or it can't stay underwater that long. That's how big their lungs are. It's a multi-cell organism. And you and I are multi-cell organisms as well. Multi-cell organisms start out as one cell, and then they form a tissue, and then the tissue forms an organ, and an organ organizes itself into specialized cells. In a human, you will have cells that are organized into eyes, others into bones, others into skin, etc. Okay. Stages of human fetal development. I don't know if you can see this, but you have the first image on the upper left-hand corner. That's 5 weeks in gestation. And then 6 weeks, then you go all the way down to the lower right-hand corner, and you have 33 weeks at that point. So you can see how a head begins to form almost right away, how an ear begins to form, how an eye begins to form, and pretty soon the limbs begin to get defined with like forearms, wrists, hands, fingers, digits, fingernails. In this one, in this illustration, you have a 9-week fetus, and or a 9-week one that is relatively small. At 12 weeks, you have the sex organs that begin to differentiate. So at 12 weeks is when the sexual or the gender of that preborn baby is beginning to show itself. At 16 weeks, you have fingers and toes that begin to develop. At 20 weeks, you have hearing that begins to develop, and that is that, and you've often heard people say that, well, I had classical music on and the baby moved inside of me because it appeared to enjoy what it was listening to. This is at 20 weeks. At 24 weeks, lungs begin to develop. And if a baby is born prematurely, like before 24 weeks or close to 24 weeks, may not survive because its lungs are not developed, and it won't be able to handle a very important commodity to human life, and that is air or oxygen. So here at halfway through the gestational period is where lungs come into play. At 28 weeks, the brain begins to grow, and it grows at a very rapid pace. At 32 weeks, bones fully develop so that you have fully formed ulna, radius, a rib cage, spinal vertebrae, and so forth. At 36, muscles fully develop. And what they mean by the development of muscles, it means that the muscles are all there, they're formed, and of course they haven't had a chance to strengthen and harden until they come out of the womb. And that's when the baby first begins to stand on its own. It may grab a hold of the edge of the sofa, and then it may get really bold and take a step or two. It'll fall down, and it'll do it over and over and over again. And that's because the muscles have got to harden. All the muscles are there, but the muscles need to harden in order for that child to become mobile. At 40 weeks, you have a full-term development. The baby is ready to come out of the oven. Okay. So maybe at this point we need to turn to the scriptures and go to Genesis chapter 2, and we'll read our verse once again. Would you open your Bibles, please, to Genesis chapter 2. Let me begin to read at verse 6. But a mist used to rise from the earth and water the whole surface of the ground. So we are given here kind of a section of time, a segment of time, a frame of time so that we can see something about the earth. Then verse 7 begins with the word then. Now this word then is important to us because it shows that there is a logical sequence. And it says, then the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Verse 7, I can't begin to tell you how important it is to our understanding of the character or the characteristic of man, that very special thing that's called life. And you can have a human body, but it has no life, and it becomes disgusting in a few days. But when there is life, there is nothing that is more cherished than your body. That's why when you bang your finger, you bring it up to your lips and you kiss it and make it better. Something happens, you're very much aware of the pain that's in your body because it's you. And here's a very interesting thing about a human being. Within his soul, a human being has self-awareness. That means that you know that you're you. Now, I know that there are some philosophers that get kind of like way out into left field, and they say, well, how do you know that I'm me? And of course, one of the Greek philosophers said, I think, therefore I am. Well, that's kind of profound, but the idea is you don't need to be a philosopher to come to the conclusion that you are you or that you are living. Almost everybody knows that, and that's because you're a human being. So, in our passage of Scripture, I want you to notice that there is a logical sequence, and that logical sequence is now going to be revealed in the development of the formation of the human body, and when God blows into his nostrils the breath of life, that something miraculous happens, and that body becomes alive and a living human being. Okay. The passage that we just read is the passage where God breathes into the nostrils of the very first man, Adam, the breath of life. And this is the first man, and this is the way that life was first given to a human being. And so we want to see, and we'll take a note of this, that the same way, the same pattern that was used in Genesis 2:7 to give life to man is exactly the same pattern that God uses every time a baby is born. Life is given to him by God. Now, I know that people like to argue about it, but you just talk to somebody who is given a stillbirth, and they are crushed. And they say, well, I did everything right. I took my vitamins, I stopped drinking, I was nice to people. Stillbirth. Only God can give life. And it's very, very important that we see that. Okay. events at Eden. Genesis 2:7 narrates a miraculous chain of events. Genesis 2:7 narrates a miraculous chain of events. The use of the Hebrew wow, that is a wow consecutive, that's that word then that I pointed out to you, reveals that each creative act of God succeeds his previous act. In other words, he did first this one, then that one, then the other one, and he took them in order. And it's important for us to see this because we will be well advised to note that when God does something, he does it decently and in order. Evolution says that things happen by chance. By chance is like rolling the dice and you don't know if a 7 is going to come up, snake guys are going to come up, or you're going to have double sixes. You just don't know. And evolutionists will tell us that life began as a roll of the dice, and it just so happened that life came. We'll see that that is pure foolishness. Letter B. Therefore, God's remarkable creations took place in a logical order. Let me repeat. Therefore, God's remarkable creations took place in a logical order. The formation of the human being. Letter B. Number 1, God's initial creation of mankind reveals 3 categories of life. Each one is inherent to every human being. The first of these is that God created biological life from the dust of the ground. And I think that last time I made reference to the human body, that if you were to buy the chemicals out on the market, that it would come to about $11. I didn't Google it to see what our human bodies are worth now, but I don't think it's going to be much more than that. But you can buy all the chemicals that you're made out of, all the chemicals that are made from the dust of the ground, and you can buy them over the counter. There is nothing special, nothing holy. You can buy them. You can put them together in a glass. You can pour a little water in it. You can stir them with a spoon. You're not going to make a human being. People have tried. They've tried over and over and over. They can't do it. Why can't they do it? Because only God gives life. And that's very important for us to know this. You see, when you think straight, your thoughts are going to be straight from here on out. Okay, I don't drink coffee. I don't like the taste of it, but I know some people love it. And in the morning, sometimes when I'm on my way out to the courthouse, I go by what used to be the 13 Buffaloes coffee drive-up, and you can smell them roasting coffee. You can also smell them from bar grains, and they're roasting coffee. And you know what they do? They take coffee beans, they put them into a mill, and then they turn the mill and they grind the coffee beans. And then those coffee beans that are ground, they're put into a solution of water, or they dissolve them into water, and you get coffee. That's the way that your mind works. When your parents are godly parents, they begin to teach you about God and about the Bible. And you're putting good old-fashioned coffee beans into that coffee mill. And when they come out and it's processed, you are going to have delicious coffee to drink. But let's say that evil Jesse shows up at Bar Greens or 13 Buffaloes, and he's got a handful of steel ball bearings, about the same size as a coffee bean, and he puts them into the coffee mill. What's going to happen? I'll tell you what's going to happen. It's going to mess up that coffee mill. It's going to beat up its gears. And little bits of steel are going to infiltrate the coffee and the coffee that you drink. And from that day on, because so much damage has been done to the blades inside the mill, you would not be able to drink the coffee because it's going to put steel shreds into your body. The same thing happens to your thinking. When you go to university, when you go to high school, and an unbelieving teacher starts to berate the Bible, to make fun of the Bible, to scoff at the Bible, they're putting ball bearings into your brain. And what comes out is shredded steel, and you won't ever think straight again unless you get it fleshed out with the Word of God. And that means that you have to have a high impact ingestion program. And of course, my recommendation is get the Bible every single day. And if it were possible for me to teach every day, that's what I would recommend to you. You come to church every single day and you get Bible doctrine to get that steel shred out of your coffee. Because that is what's messing up your thinking. And you need to get rid of it. Because if not, you're not going to be thinking straight. If there's just one little shred of stainless steel inside your brain when you're thinking about these things, you're going to say, I'm not so sure that preacher is right. Maybe there's a little tweaking that needs to be done. And then you'll wonder, how come I'm out of fellowship? How come I'm getting disciplined? How come things aren't going right for me? Well, I'll tell you why. It's real simple. Stainless steel. That's why. It's in there. And your thinking needs to be straightened out. Now, I wish that I had a magic wand like Harry Potter, and I could go like this, and I could sprinkle some wiffle dust on you and change your mind. But I can't. That has to be done by you, by your positive volition, as you apply Bible doctrine. And that's what it says in Romans chapter 12. By the renewing of your mind, do not be conformed to the world, but have your mind renewed. That takes place when you take in Bible doctrine. When you don't take it in, those shreds of the stainless steel ball bearings are going to be affecting your thinking. Okay, enough of that. So, once again, number one, God's initial creation of mankind reveals three categories of life which are inherent in every human being. First, God created biological life from the dust of the ground, the chemicals of the soil. Number one. Secondly, he created soul life out of nothing except his own essence, and imparted that life to biological life. See, where is life? I mean, we can't see it. We can't dissect it with a scalpel. We can't put a pin through it and put it in a cigar box, like a butterfly. Can't do that. And third, he combined biological life with soul life to create human life. And so we've looked at a glimpse of biological life, and that's the amoeba, the algae, all of that stuff. Number 3, Genesis 2:7 narrates this miraculous chain of events. The use of the Hebrew wow consecutive reveals that each creative act of God succeeds the previous act. Therefore, God's remarkable creations took place in a logical order. All right, number 2. God established the same sequence for Adam's progeny, that is, the human race. So how does a human become a living being? The same pattern is followed as was done with Adam in the garden. You have to have a physical body. And then once the physical body is put together, God blows into the nostrils life. This means that when you take your first breath, when you are newly born, you now have become a human being. You say, well, I thought it was a human being beforehand. I thought it was a human being when I was still inside the womb. Remember about those stainless steel ball bearings? See? God established the very same sequence that he had for Adam, and he did that for Adam's progeny. The creation of human life is done from the joining of soul life to biological life. And so what does the doctor do when the baby first comes out of the womb? Gives it a little tap on the behind so that the baby will start to breathe and cry. Now, I know that there are advocates that say, oh, you shouldn't be so cruel to a baby. You should stimulate him otherwise. So what do they suggest? Tickle the feet. Rub on its back. Don't rub too hard because you'll scare the kid. But if the kid is having trouble breathing, time for the slap. Why is that slap so important? Because you need to have that first breath or that child does not become a human being. It's so very important. We recognize it every single time that a birth is taking place. And so you probably wondered where the saying came. Brand spanking new. Why? Because that's when you became a living being. See? Then I love these two t-shirts that are off to the side. It's great to be out. And then if you look at the bottom, it says, we were running out of womb. Okay. Biological life begins with the combination of the sperm and the ovum to form what is known as a zygote. Okay, new vocabulary maybe for you. You need to know this vocabulary because this is how you can tell that number 1 is here, number 2 is here, number 3 is here, number 4 is here. Very important. Now, I've got to tell you that most ladies, most women have got this information down pat because they are reminded of this on a monthly basis. We men, I don't know, when I grew up, about 6th grade, they had a special assembly where all the girls in 6th grade were supposed to go to the assembly hall and they were shown, I don't know what they were shown, but the boys were strictly kept away. It was like a quarantine. And the girls were sworn to secrecy, not to say anything.
We were shown a picture of a moose that had eggs inside his head. And I mean, that's what it always looked like to me, was a moose. I never could figure that out.
I don't know. We were never shown the movie. So we never found out about it until late in high school when somebody whispered to us behind the auto shop. And they passed around the cigarettes and say, hey, you know what? Okay. So biological life begins. Okay, now notice biological life begins when the sperm comes in combination with the ovum. The ovum is what the girl produces as far as her menses is concerned. On this image that you have on the screen, you can see the sperm. It's a little blue thing. It is tiny, teeny, tiny, and there's of course millions of them, but it only takes one of those to fertilize the egg. Now I'm going to tell you why it's so important that this is so tiny, because I'm going to reveal to you a little later on that all of our computers and every source of information or data storage is done on what is known a linear basis. And if they could do what God has done in putting all the data that goes into making our life, it would have to go into what is known as a helic, or a third dimension. And all of the information that is in the world today that we have would fit inside of one of those sperms. Just one of them. So this has got to tell you how great God is. Because we think it's great when we can pick up our smartphone, we can say, 20 years ago, you couldn't put this much information in a cell phone. It would have to sit on your desk. And do you guys remember the TRS-80s? The trash 80s? I mean, they were huge. You almost had to use hammers to type on them. But now we've got it in a little thing like this, a cell phone. Compared to a sperm, this is thousands of times larger. So that's an aside. So when the sperm gets together with the egg, and you can see the egg is way bigger, and it fertilizes the egg, a change takes place, and it becomes a zygote. Z-Y-G-O-T-E. Very, very special word. You'll notice that the diagram of it is basically the same size as the egg, but now it's got two nuclei, or it has two brown dots in the middle. The zygote makes possible the existence of biological life, but the zygote is not a human being. Now, this is point number 1 in the parentheses, and right now I just made the Pope turn over in his bed, and every Pope before him turn over in his grave. Because they believe that as soon as fertilization takes place, you have a human being. What you have is a zygote. The zygote is biological life that resides, or that is inside of the uterus. The zygote is biological life that is inside the uterus. Okay. About how large is the zygote? About the same size as an egg. How big is that? You need a microscope. Do you know that they didn't even know that the female eggs were actually in existence until about 1927? Okay, here's the same diagram. Get the sperm as a little blue thing, have the egg as the pink thing, then it becomes a zygote. That's day 1. Day 2, it becomes an embryo. Day 2, it becomes an embryo. Now, I don't know how much you can see, but on day 2, do you see how many little round things are inside the round thing?
4.
4. How much is that compared to the zygote?
Double.
It's double. And so what you have is a replication. You start out with 2 coming together to form a zygote. Now you got the 2 little brown buttons on the inside. The very next day you got 4. And then you look at day 3, how many have you got then?
5.
Count them again. 8. That's twice as much as the day before. What's it doing? Doubling, doubling, doubling. Not just multiplying. Doubling. And so this is biological life. Day 4, it's called the morula. On day 5, it's called the blastocyst. The blastocyst. Okay. I know the picture's kind of small, So let me give you a bigger one.
Okay, that works.
Okay, you can see the female reproductive apparatus in the middle of the diagram. And if you begin at day 0, you have ovulation. That's when the egg is released. And fertilization apparently takes place that very same day, day 0. Day 1, zygote. Day 2, embryo. Day 3, embryo. Day 4, morula. Day 5, blastocyst. Day 6, implantation of the egg on the wall of the uterus. Okay, that is where this little tiny thing is going to be getting its life. If you separate it from the wall of the womb, what's going to happen? The same thing that happens to any one of those single cell organisms that doesn't feed off of somebody else. It'll die. In order for a single cell, or in this case now it's many cells, in order for it to live, it has to live off of a host. And that host is mom. This is, shall we say, the miracle of reproduction. Okay. Is there math involved in this? Darn right there is. Okay. I went to school with a lot of guys that as soon as they got kicked off the football team or something, they dropped out of school. If you were to ask them to do a math problem, they'd be completely lost. In order to come up with the mathematics for this, do you think you got to be smart or you think you got to be dumb? You got to be smart. And this is just the beginning of your life. God made you like this. This is the act of God. And this is just biological life. We haven't gotten to the rest. Okay. The zygote is biological life in the uterus. Day 1, zygote. Day 2, embryo. Day 70, it becomes a fetus. Day 280, which is 40 weeks later, the birth takes place and we say the baby was born. If the baby's stillborn, it's just like I was pregnant for 9 months, but I got nothing to show for it. Which is a heartbreak. But you see that this is the way that gestation takes place. All right, letter B, biological life is not human life in the womb. Only God can create human life. It's biological life, you see, but only God can create human life. Can you see the difference? I mean, we looked at single cell organisms, right? We saw how they can multiply. We saw how they can get really, really large, like an organ. And just because they're growing doesn't mean that they have independent life. Only God can create human life, and he does so after biological life emerges from the womb. While God delegated the reproduction of biological life to genetics, he directly creates human life outside of the womb. Okay, let me see if I can explain this last statement. What this means is that God didn't just stop creating on day 6 when he created Adam. Every time that a baby is born and lives, God has created life. Now this gives life such a high value. That is why we have capital punishment, because only God gives life, and only God should take life. Very, very important. Now you will see demonstrators on TV, and women will say, well, I gave life to this baby. That is not true. A woman does not give life to anything. Only God gives life. He's the only one. She can give biological life, but she can't give human life. At birth, biological life emerges from the womb. This is a body without a soul. At birth, God creates soul life and imputes that soul life to biological life, thus forming a human being. Let me repeat, because this is very important to have this straight. At birth, biological life emerges from the womb. It's a body without a soul. At birth, God creates soul life and imputes that soul life to biological life, thus forming a human being. Okay. Is sequence important?
Yes.
Very true. Sequence is very important. And we have noted that God is showing that there's a similarity, there's a parallelism in the sequence. God gave life to Adam in the garden by blowing air or by blowing into his nostrils. A baby that is born today gets life when he takes in his first breath. Okay, is sequence important? Let me begin with a scientist's definition or illustration or explanation of what life is. Life requires two things, movement and heat. You say, well, plants don't move. Yes, they do. You put a plant just outside of where the sun is shining, and it'll stretch itself toward the sun. That's one of the beauties of a sunflower. Sunflowers always changed so that they can face the sun. There's movement. And you will find that even when there is snow on the ground or frost on the ground, that right around the leaf or the little sprig of grass, that there's no snow there because there is heat that comes off from that leaf. Now, if it's a heavy snow, obviously it's going to cover things up. But if it's just a light snow, even though the temperature is below 30, somehow that plant generates enough heat to melt the snow around it by 1 or 2 degrees, and that's because it has life. This is very important. Once we accept this, it's like putting coffee into the coffee mill. Straight thinking. Every living cell moves and produces heat. Every living cell. Doesn't matter what it is, it produces movement and heat. So here we have the question. In order to produce this movement and this heat, how does this plant do that? Or how does this living cell do that? Let's say, for instance, that you have a car and you want it to produce some heat that's going to be transferred into turning the wheel so you can go from point A to point B. What do you have to do in order to get that car to do that? Say, well, I got to put gas in it. And I got to turn the key. And when I turn the key, the spark plugs go, and there's a fire inside of my motor, even though it's controlled, but there's a fire, and that's what makes the movement in my car. And it also produces some heat. Touch the exhaust pipe and see if there isn't. So, here's the question. How does it do that? And the answer is the secret to living cells is that they are really a system of locks and keys. So, for instance, you have an amoeba, remember, one cell organism. It doesn't have really anything that makes it spectacular, but somehow it eats, and that's how it finances its movement. Remember, an amoeba has that motility. And so it eats something. So what can it eat? It's already the smallest living thing. It eats some kind of protein. And protein, is it alive? No. It's just a molecule. It's a molecule of some inorganic something. So how does the amoeba convince the protein to release its energy? Well, the protein is like a lock, and the amoeba is like a key. The amoeba gets out the key, puts it into the protein, turns it, and opens up the lock, and now it has energy to live. That is where life is. There is a key, there is a lock. On the screen, you can see the illustration of the key and how the key is jammed into the tumblers, and that the tumbler has these pins that are on the level edge. When the tumblers are down, you can't get into the house. You can't get into the door. Once the key is put in there, it pushes all of those little pins up above the line so that the door can open or the lock can open. In order for that to be done, that key has to be a special profile. You take it down to Lowe's or somewhere, and they do a cutting, and they shape that key so that when you put it into the lock, it's able to open the lock. Does that take brains to design one of those? Darn right it does. It takes a lot of brains. Back in the times of ancient Israel, they had locks all right, made out of rope. They tied the door shut. Sometimes if they had a piece of metal, they put the piece of metal on two knobs so that you couldn't open the outhouse. Somewhere along the line, somebody said, we need to have better security. And so they started saying, well, if we invent the lock and the key, only the people with the key can get in. They said, oh, that sounds like a great idea.
Like insulin and glucose.
Like what?
Like insulin and glucose in the cells.
Very similar, yes. That's kind of what I'm getting at. When you came into this apartment house, first thing you ran into was a locked door out front. If you're able to get past that door, you'll notice that there's two other doors before you get into the apartment. The outer door also requires a key. Now we've left the lock unengaged. The second door coming into the apartment has a couple of locks. And if you wanted to get in, you have to open both of those locks to get in. So there are like 4 keys that are necessary to get into this apartment. Now, we don't consider that to be really strange. Everybody, I mean, we got keys for our car, we got keys for our tractor, we got keys for our boats, we got keys for everything. You got a locker at work, you may have a padlock with a key that goes to it. I know I've got my bikes chained downstairs in the parking area, and I've got them locked with a key. So it's not anything strange. Now, obviously, the old sin nature being what it is, somebody says, I don't have a key, but I want to get that guy's stuff. So they've taken the principle of how a lock is made, and they said, we can pick a lock. So let me show you how they pick locks. If you look at the bottom, there's this dark bar here. That pushes the bar down to allow the pick to go and to move the pins up and down so that you can clear and get inside of whatever door you want to do it. And sometimes you have to follow a sequence in order to get that done, because that's the way the locks are made. In other words, it takes a certain amount of ingenuity to come up with a key that'll open a simple lock. A lock that has 4 pins, and if you know how to pick a lock, then you can jiggle and jiggle and jiggle until you finally can get the door open. So, you have locks within your body. And it's not just 1 or 2, you have tons of them. Because every cell has a key, and there are tons of nuclei that need to be invaded, and so the key opens up all of those. Okay, we have noted that when you come into this apartment that you have to use different keys to get in. I'm sure that you have keys to get into your house. Each of these doors requires a key to open the lock. Now let me tell you a story by a very famous chemist. He's a Christian. He is an authority on cell structure. And he tells this story. His name is Wilder Smith, Dr. A.E. Wilder Smith. He said that once he was giving a lecture in Florida, and he took a tour of the Everglades. And so this is a photograph of an aerial photograph of the Everglades. And as you can see, they stretch for miles and miles. The Everglades is one huge swamp. The swamp is populated with poisonous snakes, crocodiles, alligators, poisonous spiders, almost everything that you want to avoid. And so he tells the story that somebody was going to give him a tour of the Everglades, and that they were going to do it in an airplane. They got into the airplane, and when the pilot wanted to start the airplane, he had to start it with a key. Well, it just so happened that he had a ring full of keys, and that all the keys looked the same. So he had to try them all, because only one key was going to start the plane. He finally came to a key that would actually fit into the ignition part, and he couldn't get it to turn. So he looked, and he had another one, and it wouldn't turn. And so he jiggled it until finally he got it to turn, and the airplane started, and they took off and went flying. They flew and they flew and they flew so that they would get a tour of the Everglades, and they saw all these animals in there and everything. And then they decided that they wanted to stop for lunch. Well, there just happens to be a restaurant in the middle of the Everglades. There's no car that gets there. You can only get there by boat or by plane. And so they landed, They tied the plane up at the dock. They went inside. They had a nice lunch. Time to go home. They got into the plane. They had the same deal with the key again. And they were afraid if we don't find that key, we're going to be stuck here. So they saw a little bit of a dilemma. And so finally they were able to get a key that would work, and they were able to take off. The secret to this story is that you need a key to operate a certain plane, because only one key is going to work. And that's the principle with keys and locks. The keys are tailor-made for the locks. Okay. When people say that the human body is the creation of chance, chance that had the opportunity of millions and millions and millions of years, it flies in the face of practical science. The practical science of the key and the lock. So, let's say that you were walking on the beach and that you found a Timex watch. Not a real expensive one, but, $20, $30, $40 worth of a watch. Would you say, oh my goodness, this is proof that evolution works? No, you'd look at that watch and say, it has a label on it. It says Timex, Timex. There's some fool back in New Jersey who sits at a mass production belt and he is stamping out watches, and someone must have lost it and dropped it here. That's what you would say. Now, a Timex watch is not nearly as complicated as a Rolex. If you found a Rolex, you would say, oh my goodness, this is my lucky day. I had just found $5,000 worth of watch. It operates on jewels so that each moving part moves precisely when it's supposed to. Some talented watchmaker made this watch. Well, your life is thousands of times more complicated than a Rolex watch. And so you would be foolish to say that. The same thing exists when people say that you are just made by chance, that human beings are made by chance. Because if you look at a key and a lock, you know that somebody had to design that key for that lock and vice versa. When people say that the human body is a creation by chance, it flies in the face of the practical science of the key and the lock. In order for a key to open a lock, it must be ground to a profile that is tailor-made for that lock. That's why you go to Lowe's and they do that. In fact, they've got like about 30 or 40 different blanks, because not every key will open every lock. And so they have to get exactly the right one. So if you wanted a more sophisticated key than just the usual key, a key that would open several locks, that's called a master key, it too would have to have a very special profile. So for instance, if we wanted to get into this apartment with just one key, we would have to have a key specially made to open the front door, to open the next door, and to open the two locks on the inner door. That is amazing. That takes a great deal of time and ingenuity to make that kind of a key. Well, the human body has 4 such locks. And it's not just the human body, it's the digestive system of the human body. There's the mouth, there is the stomach, there's the large intestines and the small intestines. 4 of these locks. Now, I want to say that each one of these locks has its own special profile of teeth, because it's difficult to get in there. Now, Is it this Sunday that we're having communion in church?
No,
Oh, we had it last Sunday?
Sunday before.
We had it the Sunday before? I lost track. The last time we had communion, and the men passed out the bread and the cup. You took the piece of bread, you put it in your mouth, and instantly, over 20 enzymes started to break that bread down. That's even before you closed your teeth on it. That's equivalent to 20 of those little ripples on a key for a lock. And as that bread was in your mouth and in your tongue, it started to break that bread down chemically with just exactly the right keys to get into the proteins, to get into the starches, and to send them to their proper place. Once they went past your mouth, down into your stomach, once they get into your stomach, everything changes again, because the pH level is a whole different environment there. And when the pH level is different in your stomach, different acids and different other things start to work. And you know what? It's not very pleasant down there. You know that because every time that you puke or you throw up or you puke in your mouth, it tastes terrible. You can hardly wait to wash your mouth out. That's because different key has to work in your stomach to break down what you have just swallowed. After it goes through your stomach, it goes to your large intestine, where your large intestine is, doing this to break it down even more. Then it goes into your lower intestine or your little intestine, getting it ready to go out the back door. And once again, you wouldn't want to put that in your mouth because there's a different key that is going in there with more enzymes and more chemical reactions that are taking place. Now, God, with one key, has done that for you. 4 different areas, 4 different locks, each one intricately. It's impossible to even figure out how to do this. Man can't design something that complicated and that works that well. Every day you eat like 3, 4, 5 times a day. That works instantly each and every time. It works in you, it works in me. Go have Mexican food, works. Go have Chinese food, it works. Now you may be allergic to some, it may not work for that. But then that's because you're not normal. You're allergic to stuff. If you were normal, then the work of God would take its place and you would go through everything exactly that way. The instant you put that thing in your mouth, already it starts to work. Sometimes maybe you get up in the morning and you don't quite get all that you wanted for breakfast. And you're maybe sitting in class, or maybe you're sitting at your desk at your work, and you're sitting there and you're trying to think, but your thoughts are interrupted by this terrible noise coming from your stomach. Like that. Why is that? Because the key has opened the door down there. See? That is how wonderful God has made you. Okay, how are we doing here for time? Couple more things. This is the key. Each of the little teeth on a key, or each profile on a key, is actually a code. And you have codes in your body. Now, a code is something very, very special, because the molecule of your cell and the molecule of the food that it eats has to have matching codes. Okay. Let's say that we're going to start a code, and it's going to be a 3-letter code. going to begin with CA. But we have to add a third letter. Okay, so CA, I guess if we start at the beginning of the alphabet, I guess we could go with a B, cab. Okay, so I say cab. You know what I mean by cab. I think you know. I don't know, in your mind you might be thinking taxi, cab. Or maybe you're thinking pickup truck cab.
Cab Galloway.
Hard to say, right? So in order for you to understand what I'm thinking, we have to agree that when I say cab, that's what we're talking about. So we're starting out with this code CA. If it's not CAB, maybe it's something else. Let's say CAD, CAD. What's a CAD? That's, shall we say, a what? A deceitful Christian? Oh, a deceitful person? Yeah, there you go. Yeah, he's kind of like a flirtatious young man or older man who's manipulative and things like that. CAD. What if I go CAP? Cap. It's a hat. Okay. So up until now we've done 4 codes, right? Or 4 codes? Just by adding one letter. Okay. Suppose that we add a different letter. Suppose that we add a T.
Cat.
Cat. So now we have a different thing altogether. And everybody in their mind can see a cat. But some people may see a tabby, a little flat-faced tabby. Others may see a lynx. Others may see some jazz musician. A cat, It's a code. In order for a code to work, you have to agree with me. That's what we're talking about. And this is where misunderstandings come in, when we don't understand what the other person is saying. Well, with these molecules that exist in our bodies, they understand each other. And God has made them to understand each other so that they can open the proteins when they need to open the proteins. They can open the starch when the starch is needed to be opened. They can open the sugars when they need to be opened. It's code. Okay. For that, there needs to be an agreement. Okay. So, we started out with a 3-letter code, but we had given only 2 letters, the first 2 letters. Let's say, for instance, that we are given a lot more letters. Let's say 26, like our alphabet. What combinations could you come up with? Tons. Look at all these books up here. They all come from those 26 letters. Okay. There's millions of combinations that those codes do. That's what your cells do. Your cells, your internal cell structure is actually made with 3 radicals. We call them DNA or RNA. And you will note that when they take it and they diagram it out, it looks like a spiral. Remember I was telling you about the helix? And that dictates, are you going to have red hair, blue eyes, you're going to have black hair, you're going to be short, you're going to be fat, you're going to have heart disease. All of that stuff is information that's already in there. That's code. Okay? God has done that for you. Now, code is something that came up very essentially in the history of man. Because even in primitive times when people didn't have math skills, they would have to know how much tribute they would have to pay to the guy who's acting as king. And the guy who's acting as king has come to my house with a couple of brutes, And they have said, if you don't give us so many ears of corn a week, we're going to burn your house down. So you don't want them to burn your house down. We call it taxation. So he says he needs to have 20 ears of corn a week. There's 52 weeks in a year. So how many ears of corn is that? How are they going to keep track of that? Well, this is something that I learned from my dad when I was just a little kid because he was teaching me numbers. The ancient people, particularly the Indians in the Americas, they use very skinny ropes. And if you tied a knot in a rope, that stood for 10 ears of corn, for instance. You had 2 knots in a rope, now you got 20. If you got 3, you got 30. Each knot would represent so much. The Japanese use an abacus, little contraption with little beads on wires, and they slide these things up and down, and they know exactly how many of those things. What is it? It's code.
Chinese
See?
kids use that. They're really good at it too.
Yeah, and that's because that's something that God has put into us. Now, let's say that you're on the Titanic or you're on some ship and it sinks. It's beginning to sink. You want to go to the radio room and send out a message. You don't have a whole lot of time, so you will send out a message that is SOS. What does that mean? Sauce?
Sorry.
Save our ship, save our souls.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what we come up with. Anybody who gets that message in whatever language, it means we need help. That's what it means. Okay. So, I'm on the ship. The ship is sinking. The water is up to my ankles. And I want to send out an SOS message. But I realize that I'm in the North Atlantic and most of those people have a Cyrillic alphabet. And their S's are different than my S's. How are they going to know? Because in a code, you have to agree with each other. So I will go dot, dot, dot. It's kind of like on a rope, 3 knots. Then I put in a double knot, and another double knot, and another double knot, and that's dash, dash, dash. And then I put in another knot, that's and another, so you got 3 dots, 3 dashes, and 3 dots. SOS. Everybody knows what that means. That's code. But what does that require? It requires that the person in Russia, the person in China, the person in Argentina knows what that means. It's an agreement. God made our cells to agree with one another so that this cell can feed off of this non-organic protein and turn it into life. That only God can do. Very, very important. Only God can do that. It's a code. You have to have intelligence for that. You can't do without intelligence. Okay, I can see that I'm already out of time.